The wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves across the Wyoming plains, tearing through the skeletal trees and dragging fine needles of snow sideways through the air. A lone rider pushed forward against the storm, head down, coat flapping, hoarse, snorting steam. His name was Calder Boone, though he hadn't said it aloud in years. His coat was dusted white with frost, and a wide-brimmed hat shielded eyes too tired to care what came next. The land was white and dead and wide enough to bury 1,000 pasts, but Calder's ghosts had sharp teeth and colder hands than winter ever could. Smoke. Not from his campfire. It was acrid, recent, the kind that clings to skin like guilt. Calder reined his horse toward the scent and crested a knoll. Below, a homestead lay gutted, timbers still smoldering, roof caved in. No sign of life, no footprints, just melted holes in the snow where the heat had bled out. Scattered among the ashes, Calder saw something that made him freeze. A child's rag doll, one eye missing, lying face down in the snow. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching, breath fogging the air. A wind chime clinked faintly in the cold. The whole world felt like it had stopped breathing. He squatted beside the doll, picked it up. There were scuff marks near the porch, drag marks, tiny. He looked to the horizon. The storm whispered to move on. His gut said otherwise. Calder had once been a sniper in the Confederate Army, the kind they sent ahead into places no light returned from. A surgeon with a rifle. They'd called him Longshot Boone, back when his name meant something to men in uniforms. But after the war turned dark, after they burned a church full of civilians in Tennessee, he walked away. Desertion, they called. Cowardice, they spat. But Calder had stared at the flames too long and couldn't stomach the smell of roasted innocence. When he returned to Georgia, his wife and infant son were buried under a stone marked by a single date. Typhoid fever, the doctor said. He'd missed the funeral by 2 weeks. The army hadn't let him go sooner. Maybe he hadn't wanted to. Either way, he never forgave himself. That was 6 winters ago. Since then, he'd ridden west with the wind, changing names like shirts, drifting from cattle drives to outlaw towns. He didn't drink much, didn't smile ever, and never stayed long. Enough to bury roots. The only thing he carried from the past was a scarred pistol and a pocket watch that hadn't ticked since the day his son died. It was dusk when he rode into the outskirts of a town called Dead River. Half the buildings looked more abandoned than claimed. Boards covered windows. Horses seemed spooked. He passed a church with its bell missing, a saloon with more dust than laughter. Inside the general store, the old woman behind the counter didn't ask his name. She didn't need to. The kind of man Calder looked like didn't make friends, only purchases. She gave him a tin of beans and a single candle. "Don't linger come dark," she said, voice like sandpaper. "Things go missing." He raised an eyebrow. "Children," she added, quieter. "Third one this month." Calder's spine stiffened. At the saloon, he asked the bartender, a soft-bellied man with eyes that flinched, what happened. The man didn't answer, just poured a whiskey and slid it down the bar. A local widow whispered to him as he saddled up again, her voice trembling, like leaves before the fall. "There's a barn, red as sin, west of the ridge. Don't go near it. Things ain't right there." He didn't respond. Just nodded once and rode out into the dusk, the words chasing him like shadows. He told himself he wasn't going to get involved, but the image of the burned homestead wouldn't let go. Neither would the doll, or the thought of his own child, eyes wide and crying, lost somewhere in the cold. He followed the western ridge where the pines grew thicker and snow fell heavier. He saw signs, faint boot prints, small ones, barely holding shape in the ice. And something else. Claw marks on the bark of a tree. Deliberate. Markings. Outside another farmhouse, he found a doll impaled on a fence post. In the woods, a trapper with wild eyes and frost-bitten fingers told him, "They wear hoods now, not uniforms. But I seen. Their eyes. Same devils from the war. They ain't dead. They just changed uniforms." Calder left him muttering to the snow and pressed on. Then through the trees it rose from the white like a scar, tall, looming in red as a butcher's apron. The barn. Its paint was flaking, but the hue bled through the frost like a wound. It sat low, half hidden in a copse of pines, surrounded by snowdrifts and silence. No horses, no signs of life, just an eerie stillness. Calder dismounted and tied his horse under the trees. The crunch of his boots seemed too loud. He moved like a whisper, fingers trailing over the worn planks of the barn's siding until he found a gap at the rear. The door creaked only slightly as he slipped inside. Dark, musty, the scent of mold and rot and something worse. He moved between hay bales, past rusted tools and old tack hanging like nooses. Then he heard it. A whimper, faint, barely audible. He froze, listening. There it was again. A muffled sob. He followed the sound to the hayloft where the straw had been pulled back. Hidden beneath a tarp were 6 children, 2 girls, 4 boys, bound and gagged, eyes wide with terror. Calder's heart thudded in his chest. He moved quickly, cutting ropes with his knife, whispering calm. One of the boys had bruises across his face. One of the girls clung to a broken music box. Then he saw it, along the barn walls, hung like war trophies, old uniforms, Confederate gray, faded, torn, but unmistakable. Symbols stitched on the sleeves he knew too well. A ghostly horse rearing on its hind legs. The mark of the Ghost Riders, a secret squadron formed in the war's dying days. Hunters, executioners. Calder's breath caught. His throat felt dry as dust. He hadn't heard that name in a long time, because he used to ride with them, until he didn't. And now they were here, alive and taking children. His jaw clenched. He wasn't leaving this barn without them, or without a reckoning. Calder worked fast, his hands shaking only slightly as he cut the last of the ropes binding the children. Their eyes darted around the barn like startled deer, afraid to believe they were being rescued. One little girl whimpered beneath her gag, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Calder knelt, pulled the cloth from her mouth gently, and pressed a finger to his lips. She nodded. He moved through them like a ghost, lifting each child one by one and directing them toward a hidden trapdoor. Beneath loose floorboards he'd discovered moments before, a root cellar, half frozen, just deep enough to keep them hidden. He'd cover them with hay and boards just long enough to buy time. Then, just as he reached for the last child, a boy with a crooked arm and missing shoe, someone kicked over a lantern. It clattered against the floor and rolled, sputtering flame before Calder pounced and smothered it with his coat. But the noise had already echoed. From outside came the creak of footsteps in the snow, heavy and deliberate. Calder's eyes darted to the front of the barn. A shape past the slats, a silhouette in a long coat, hat pulled low, rifle slung. One of the riders was back. Without thinking, Calder pushed the last child into the cellar, yanked the boards over them, and drew a heavy hammer from the wall. The door creaked open. The man stepped in slow, scanning the barn, boots crunching old straw. He turned just in time to see Calder charge from the shadows. They collided hard. The rider swung his rifle butt up, catching Calder across the ribs. Pain flared white-hot, but Calder didn't let go. He slammed the hammer into the man's thigh. Once, twice. The rider screamed, tried to draw a knife, but Calder wrapped an old rope around his neck and pulled. They fell together, crashing through hay. The fight was ugly, desperate grunts, punches thrown in the dark. Calder gritted his teeth, forced. The rope tighter, tighter, until the man stopped thrashing. When it was over, Calder lay on the cold barn floor, chest heaving. The body beside him stared with empty eyes. He rolled away and sat there in silence, sweat freezing on his back. Then, trembling, he dragged the corpse behind the barn and buried it beneath the snow with bare hands. Blood stained the white like spilled ink. Back inside, he crouched by the trapdoor. The children stared at him with wide, questioning eyes. He didn't speak. He just nodded once. They weren't safe yet. They had to move. Calder led the children single file through the woods, behind the barn, keeping to the low branches and frozen stream beds. The snow had eased, but the air was colder than before, the kind of cold that cut through coats and made your bones ache. He pushed through it, keeping them moving, always listening. They reached a narrow gorge flanked by tall cliffs, the wind funneling through like a whispering voice. Calder paused, scouted ahead, just a few more miles to where he thought the nearest outpost might be. Then, gunshots. He turned just in time to see two men burst from the trees above, rifles raised. One fired, the shot grazing Calder's shoulder and spinning him to the snow. He cried out, blood darkening his coat. The children screamed. The two Ghost Riders approached with the lazy menace of men who thought the fight was already over. Calder tried to lift his pistol, but his arm wouldn't obey. Then, a sharp whistle in the wind. An arrow cut through the air and struck one rider in the throat. He gurgled and dropped. The other spun toward the trees, only to take a second arrow in the chest. Silence. From the shadows of the pines, a figure emerged. A woman, lithe and strong, wearing a deerskin coat and carrying a carved bow across her back. Her face was unreadable. High cheekbones, eyes dark as thunderclouds, black hair braided tightly against the cold. Around her neck hung a bear tooth. She said nothing, only raised a hand and gestured for Calder to follow. Behind her, the trees, open to a narrow path, a safe trail, a way out. Calder didn't hesitate. He gathered the children, clutching his bleeding shoulder, and followed the silent woman into the woods. The path led them to a hidden cave tucked beneath a rock outcropping. Snow camouflaged its mouth, and a brush of pine concealed the entrance entirely from above. Inside it was warmer, dry. A small fire flickered near the rear, already prepared. Tala, the name she would not speak but later gesture, moved with quiet purpose. She gestured for the children to sit, fed them small pieces of dried meat and warm broth from a battered kettle. She moved among them like smoke, soft and calming. When she reached Calder, she examined his wound without a word. Her fingers were quick, confident. She tore cloth into bandages, cleaned the cut stitched with care. He hissed once and she paused, meeting his eyes. He nodded. Go on. She finished the work and stepped back. In the firelight, Calder studied her. She was no stranger to pain. Her hands bore old scars. Her eyes had seen too much. He spoke low. You knew those men. She said nothing, just nodded once. She crouched and drew lines in the dirt with a stick. A barn, stick figures, flames. She pointed to a small one, her, and a bigger one she crossed out. Her brother, gone, same men, same fate. Calder didn't need words. He saw it. She pulled out a small totem from her pouch, a carved wolf, worn smooth with time. She handed it to a little girl who had started to cry. The child clutched it and calmed instantly. Calder watched her, a quiet awe blooming in his chest. No anger, no vengeance in her eyes, only purpose. He reached into his coat, pulled out his old knife, and turned the handle toward her. She studied him, then took it. No words, just understanding. Later that night, Calder stared into the fire as the children slept in a tight huddle. Tala sat across from him, watching the flames, silent as ever. He finally spoke. I used to ride with them, long time ago, before I knew what they were. She didn't answer, didn't need to. He looked at her, voice low. They'll come, they'll track us. Tala nodded once. He stood and reached for his rifle. His fingers moved without thought, checking the chamber, cleaning the barrel. He glanced down at the children, then at Tala. Watch them, he said. If I don't come back, she cut him off with a look. Hard, unwavering. She wasn't burying anyone else today. Calder offered a grim smile. I've got ghosts to bury. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow. He disappeared into the trees, his figure swallowed by white and pine, moving toward the barn once more, for answers or vengeance. The snow had thickened by the time Calder returned to the red barn. Darkness smothered the trees, and the wind carried a silence so heavy it felt sacred. He moved low and slow, a wraith beneath the pines. The barn stood like a wound against the black horizon, its blood-colored walls glowing faint in the moonlight. There were more horses tied out front now, more tracks in the snow. 8, maybe 9 riders total. Ghost riders. Calder crept through the tree line and slipped beneath a collapsed portion of fence, crawling on his belly until he reached the barn's west wall. From a broken plank he peered inside. The riders were drinking and laughing, their boots echoing across the floorboards like war drums. Lanterns cast wild shadows on the beams. A pot of stew boiled over a fire pit. They looked like men in a camp. But Calder knew the truth. He spotted the man by the fire. Tall, square-jawed, gray hair slicked back beneath a black hat. A saber hung at his waist. His voice was gravel soaked in whiskey. Major Rusk. Calder's breath froze in his throat. Once, long ago, he'd ridden under that voice. Rusk had commanded the Ghost Riders during the war's darkest chapters, back when the Confederacy knew it was dying and wanted to take something with it. Rusk never surrendered, never intended to. Now he was here, alive, and worse, he was speaking of children like cattle. "We move at dawn," Rusk said, pacing before the men. "Old Carver's caravan runs through Devil's Hollow by sunrise. He'll pay top dollar for unsullied stock. Little ones fetch the most. Foreign buyers want 'em quiet, broken in. By the time anyone in town starts looking again, we'll be halfway across the territory." A grunt of agreement rose. One man asked, "And Boone?" Rusk stopped walking. "The traitor," he growled. "Boone's been a hunted man since Shiloh. He spat on everything we stood for. He's a ghost now, but if he's breathing, I'll hang him myself and watch his boots kick." Calder felt a cold clarity settle over him. He slipped away. Inside a dark side shed near the barn, Calder found what he needed. 2 crates of old black powder, likely stashed from the war days. Oil flasks, a few broken lanterns. He moved with surgical precision, pouring oil into cracks in the walls, stringing fuse lines with care, planting powder beneath the hayloft supports. His body screamed with every movement, the stab wound in his side pulsing like a heartbeat. But his mind was somewhere else, back in the war, moving through shadows like a whisper of death. On one of the dead riders from the ambush earlier, he scrawled a note in charcoal. "You should have stayed dead." He pinned it to the man's chest and left the body half covered in snow just outside the main path. Then he waited. Snow fell soft, muffling the world, muting it like a hand over a mouth. The barn glowed faintly with candlelight inside, shadows moving behind the slats like devils dancing. Calder watched from the trees, rifle across his lap, fuse cord wrapped and ready. He breathed slow. One chance, one shot, one last war. The first bullet snapped through the air at exactly midnight. It cracked from the ridge, hitting a rider in the throat. He dropped backward, knocking over a crate. The lantern he held smashed. Fire spilled. Panic exploded. Men screamed. Horses reared. A second shot took another through the gut before anyone knew where it came from. Then Calder moved. He descended from the trees, rifle blazing, each shot deliberate. The barn's front door slammed open as men poured out into the snow, firing wild. But Calder was already past them, inside, moving through the maze of hay and flame. He struck one down with a hammer, another with his knife. The barn pulsed with shadows. Gunfire flared like lightning inside it. Blood hit the wood. Calder ducked behind a beam, reloaded. Pain lanced through his side. He bit down and kept going. A figure lunged at him near the feed trough. Calder rolled and drew his pistol, shooting point blank. Then he saw her. Tala, stepping through smoke like a phantom. She moved in silence, knife flashing in one hand, her Zimbao discarded. One rider didn't even see her before she slit his throat. Another turned, raising his pistol, and Calder shot him clean through the chest before he could breathe her name. They moved as one now, covering, striking, retreating. She watched his back. He watched hers. Then, near the loft stairs, Rusk appeared. He stepped through the carnage like a preacher in hell. His saber was drawn, blood along its edge. He was older, thicker now, but no less deadly. "You," he snarled. "I knew it. I knew you'd crawl back." Calder leveled his pistol. "You always said ghosts came home. You think this makes you righteous? We were soldiers, Boone. You turned your back on your men. I turned my back on monsters." Rusk bared his teeth. "We were the last line, the edge of the blade. You left honor burning behind us a long time ago, Calder said quietly, then fired. The bullet took Rusk in the chest, but not before the saber drove into Calder's side. Calder staggered back, bleeding. Rusk, falling beside him with a look of surprise frozen on his face. The fuse was already lit. Calder limped through the barn, past dead men and dying echoes. He grabbed Tala's arm as she finished off a last struggling rider, and together they half fell through the rear entrance. Behind them, the barn's walls began to glow. First red, then gold, then a scream of fire rising toward the sky. The snow turned orange. The wind changed direction. Flames ripped through the roof, powder igniting with a deafening boom. The barn collapsed in on itself, a funeral pyre for every sin buried in its boards. Calder dropped to his knees in the snow, the blood in his side pouring freely now, steam rising from his coat. He stared at the inferno with glassy eyes. Tala stood. Beside him, her breath a mist. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and together, they watched the past burn to ash. The world came back slow, as if through smoke. Calder stirred under a blanket of hide, the dull pain in his side burning like embers buried deep in snow. The air inside the cave was warm, the kind of warmth that came not just from fire, but from air. The children were safe. He could hear their soft breathing nearby, curled against one another like pups in a den. The scent of pine smoke mingled with the sharp tang of crushed herbs. Tala had left a poultice pressed against his wound. Bandaged tight, he turned his head. She sat at the mouth of the cave, silhouetted against the paling night sky, the first hints of sunrise brushing the snow-blown ridges in pink and gold. For a long moment, Calder just watched. He saw it then. The colors of a new day rolling over. The valley spilling between the trees like water finding its path. He remembered the way his wife used to hum to their son in the early light, her voice soft as birdsong. He remembered a laugh, high, innocent, a little hand that used to grip his thumb. He reached for the memory, but it was already fading, like breath on glass. Tala turned, meeting his eyes. Without a word, she approached and knelt beside him. From a small pouch around her neck, she withdrew. A carved bear tooth, smooth and weathered, strung on a leather cord. She placed it gently in Calder's palm. He didn't speak, just closed his fingers around it. There were some gestures that didn't need words. Outside the cave, the wind had quieted. The silence felt different now. Not hollow, just waiting. Later that morning, the sharp jangle of tack and hooves echoed through the gorge. Calder's hand went to his pistol, but Tala shook her head. From a ridge above, smoke curled. Signal. Fires she must have lit during the night. The riders who approached wore badges. A local sheriff dismounted first, a weathered man with eyes like slate and a rifle across his back. He took one look at the cave, the children, the blood-streaked man on the bedroll, and nodded slow. "Name?" he asked. Calder looked away, hesitated, but only for a second. "Boone. Calder Boone." The sheriff studied him for a long time, then said, "The Boone? Ghost Rider's Boone?" Calder didn't flinch. "Was." The man squinted. "You part of this mess?" I ended it. The sheriff let out a slow breath. "Then we're square." Calder sat up straighter, grimacing against the pain. "What'll happen to the children? They'll be taken east, found homes, real ones. Good folk still out there, even if they're scattered." "I'll go with them," Calder said, the words surprising even himself. "See 'em safe." The sheriff raised a brow. A man could disappear easy after a night like that. Not many'd stick around. Calder looked toward the children huddled near the fire. Warm now, alive. "I spent too long running." The sheriff nodded once, approving. "World needs more men willing to stand between monsters and kids." As noon approached, the valley slowly began to breathe again. The children were bundled into a wagon, blankets over their laps, eyes still, wide with the shadow of what they'd seen. Calder rode beside them on a weathered gray mare, his rifle laid across his knees. Tala watched from the edge of the gorge, her face unreadable beneath her hood. She had chosen to stay. This was her valley. Her ghosts, her brother's bones buried beneath the roots of these trees. Calder approached her alone. He didn't offer a goodbye, not with words. Instead, he held out the bare tooth she'd given him. She closed his fingers around it again. This time it was hers to keep. A glance passed between them, silent, rich, final. Not sorrowful, not sweet. Just true. Then she turned and faded back into the pines, her steps leaving no trace. As the wagon rolled eastward, mile by mile, Calder felt the cold air begin to shift. It wasn't warmer, just less heavy, less haunted. Small boy sitting beside him tugged on his sleeve. The child handed over a crumpled drawing, done in charcoal and ash on the back of an old invoice. A cowboy. Beside him, a woman with long dark hair, and between them, a bear. Calder stared at it a long time, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside his coat close to his heart. The road stretched out before them, rutted, narrow, winding through mountains that had seen blood and peace in equal measure. Behind them, the red barn was nothing but scorched timbers and black earth, a grave for monsters. Ahead lay towns, tracks, maybe even redemption. But Calder Boone didn't ride for redemption anymore. He rode for something quieter, something worth guarding. Voiceover, soft and low, over the rolling wheel sounds and soft wind. Some men leave trails of blood, others trails of fire. Calder Boone left ashes so no child would walk his road alone. The screen fades to black. Call to action. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more unforgettable frontier tales, and tell us below, what would you have done in Calder's boots?